When John announced that his nephew Tyler would be staying with us for the entire summer, I felt a slight thrill. Honestly, I had expected this summer to pass in the usual routine: home, workouts, a few short trips with John. We were both tired from our busy work schedules and were looking forward to a simple, peaceful rest. And then came the news that we'd have a guest, and not just anyone, but young Tyler, whom I remembered as just a boy. I realized I hadn't seen him in a long time. The last time he visited us, he was around 16, a thin teenager with messy hair and an awkward smile. Several years had passed, and by now he must have changed, but in my mind I still pictured him as a boy. I tried to recall details, but my thoughts drifted elsewhere. I wondered what he looked like now. Was he taller, maybe even resembling John in his youth? When it was time to prepare for dinner, I decided to take it seriously. Standing in front of the mirror, I assessed my reflection. Toned body, slightly tanned skin, soft curls falling over my shoulders. I felt a bit of excitement, though I couldn't explain why. I enjoyed how the light summer dress fit on me. Soft silk hugged my figure, highlighting what I had worked to keep in shape for years. I smiled at my reflection, realizing that perhaps I wanted to look a little better than usual. When the doorbell rang, I was already descending the stairs, calming myself. It was just a guest. John opened the door, and as I took a few steps down, I finally saw Tyler. But it seemed that the person standing before me wasn't the boy I had expected to see. Tall, with a confident gaze and a neatly kept beard, he looked more like a young man than the awkward teenager I remembered. His gaze met mine, and the moment hung in the air, as if the room had grown slightly tighter, as though something in the atmosphere had shifted, though it was unclear what. Tyler looked at me, raising an eyebrow slightly, and it seemed to me that his gaze lingered a bit longer than necessary. I barely held back a smile and felt a slight embarrassment, though I wondered why I was embarrassed. After all, he was just my husband's nephew. But there was something new in that look, something that stirred a strange, barely perceptible sensation within me, as if I felt a part of myself awaken, long forgotten. John suggested we move to the kitchen, and I followed them. Tyler was confident, but there was something in his movements, in the glances he threw here and there, that suggested a hint of tension. He was trying to appear calm, but I sensed it almost intuitively. We exchanged a few words, mostly out of politeness, but the faint feeling of tension never left me. As I finished clearing the table after dinner, I tuned into my own sensations. Was it all in my head, or had something sparked between us, as if Tyler's gaze and presence had altered the usual rhythm of our home? I tried to distract myself, to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, but the small, almost weightless trace left by his gaze refused to disappear. I thought about the summer ahead and couldn't shake off this light, strange thrill. The next morning, John suggested we spend the day by the pool. It was the perfect place to relax and forget the fleeting thoughts that, for some reason, wouldn't leave me since last night's dinner. But as I chose my swimsuit, I suddenly felt a faint excitement. My fingers reached for the black bikini that emphasized the lines of my body, fitting like a second skin. I thought about enjoying my good shape, but caught myself on the confidence this choice brought me. When I went down to the pool, I saw Tyler swimming, slicing through the water with ease. His tanned, strong body moved in sync with the sunlight that reflected off each of his movements. I stopped for a moment, watching him confidently reach the pool's edge and brush the water off his face. My intuition sensed something deeper in his glance that he directed at me. While John prepared cool drinks, I walked to the edge of the pool and dipped my foot in the cool water. Tyler gave a quick glance, and his eyes, without looking away, slid over me with a barely perceptible curiosity. His gaze lingered a bit longer than I expected, and I suddenly felt something respond deep within me. That subtle yet piercing look left an inexplicable warmth in me, one that I could not ignore. I entered the water and swam to the center of the pool, trying not to think about what was unsettling me. Swimming had always been a way to release tension, but as I felt his gaze on me, I realized I wasn't so easily distracted from my own sensations. When I turned my head to take a breath, I noticed he was watching me again. There was something barely perceptible in his eyes that seemed to turn an ordinary pool day into something different, less familiar and safe. After I got out of the pool, Tyler came over and handed me a towel. His smile was light, almost friendly, but there was a slight shadow of something else in it. He gave me a compliment. "Aunt Claire, you look younger than I remember. It's incredible." The compliment sounded casual, but I felt it go straight inside, leaving a barely perceptible mark. And suddenly, I couldn't shake off this strange feeling. Smiling, I pretended his words hadn't affected me. But as I returned to the house, I felt a light blush lingering on my face from his words. We continued the day as if nothing had happened, as if that exchange of glances and innocent compliment were just part of everyday life. But the warmth left by his words followed me, and to my surprise, I didn't want it to fade. On that warm day, I chose a light dress, airy with soft lines, sliding over my body like a silk stream. I stood in front of the mirror assessing my reflection. The dress perfectly highlighted my curves, and I couldn't help but smile, feeling a slight surge of confidence. This feeling surprised me, as if I were finding something new within myself, despite seeing myself in the mirror every day. Perhaps it was simply the desire to feel beautiful, but deep down, I understood it wasn't just an ordinary mood. When I left the room and walked down the hallway, glancing towards Tyler's room, I heard his voice. He was looking at me without taking his eyes off, and in his gaze there was a light that instantly made me feel different. "You look amazing," he said with a light smile, as if it were a fact he couldn't help but mention. The words sounded unexpected, with such ease as if he hadn't thought at all about what he was saying. Yet there was a hidden sincerity in the compliment that was hard to ignore. Trying to maintain a calm exterior, I smiled, feeling my heart slow slightly in rhythm. A strange sensation rose from within, as though his words left some sort of mark, barely noticeable yet tangible. Later that evening, Tyler and I found ourselves in the kitchen. I was preparing dinner, and he volunteered to help while John stepped out for a few minutes. There was a light, casual atmosphere between us. But everything changed when Tyler, turning to the cupboard, accidentally touched my shoulder. It was just a fleeting touch, but I felt a barely perceptible electric charge pass over my skin. I looked at him, intending to say something, but my words got caught halfway, and he seemed slightly embarrassed, holding his gaze on me a bit longer than usual. In that moment, I couldn't help but notice how a light tension once again filled the air between us, making it almost palpable. It was as if an invisible thread stretched between us, connecting our gazes, yet simultaneously putting me on the edge of something unknown and thrilling. I glanced back at the cutting board, trying to return to reality. That brief moment, that accidental touch, perhaps it was just a trick of my mind. But every time I remembered his compliment, his fleeting gaze, I couldn't rid myself of the feeling that this simple moment meant something more. The next day, I happened to notice Tyler sitting on the couch with his phone, engrossed in a conversation. He smiled, occasionally chuckling, and judging by his expression, the conversation was engaging. As I passed behind him, I slowed down and caught a glimpse of part of his phone screen from the corner of my eye. For a moment, it seemed like there was a photo, something a bit more revealing than it should have been. The girl he was chatting with clearly wasn't shy about expressing her interest, and the picture itself looked almost like a personal invitation. I felt something tighten inside me. A slight feeling of annoyance suddenly turned into something more, almost painful. I didn't immediately realize what had bothered me so much, but when Tyler, unaware of my presence, continued typing, I felt like I couldn't just let it go. Out of nowhere, a strange irritation overtook me. Of course, he's a young guy, attractive, self-assured, and messages like this from girls his age weren't unusual. But suddenly I realized that it was hard for me to imagine him with someone else. It felt wrong, as though someone had intruded on our small world, which we had begun sharing this summer. All day, I couldn't shake this feeling, a strange mix of jealousy and irritation. My mind tried to explain it simply. It was just a reaction to aging, to seeing my youth slipping away while someone beside me radiated energy and confidence. But I knew it wasn't just that. My interest in Tyler had gone beyond mere curiosity. He had become something more to me than just John's nephew. With each passing day, I thought of him more, and each glance, each casual compliment lingered in my mind, as though I couldn't shake this growing feeling that was building inside me like tension. That evening, I headed to the bedroom, ready to forget these thoughts that had plagued me all day. When John came in, I felt an overwhelming desire to be with him, as though I needed to prove something to myself, to regain some confidence. Our evening was more passionate than usual, but as I lay in his arms afterward, I realized something was still missing. I felt that the inner tension had only momentarily faded, but the satisfaction I had hoped to feel never came. In the morning, I went down to the kitchen as usual, savoring the moments of quiet before the day began. But to my surprise, I found Tyler already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, lost in thought. He seemed just as surprised as I was, and as our eyes met, he smiled, inviting me to join him. We began talking about nothing in particular, and I noticed he seemed especially pensive that morning. Our conversation flowed unexpectedly deeply, shifting from everyday topics to personal dreams and plans, things that aren't usually discussed over morning coffee. He talked about his desire to build a career, but he wasn't in a hurry to follow the standard rules, wanting instead to live at his own pace, to find his own path. There was a maturity in his words that I hadn't anticipated. Barely noticeable hints of confidence, a desire to understand himself. These things set him apart from the young people I'd met before. "It seems like you always know what you want," I said, feeling his honesty touch something important within me. Tyler looked at me a bit more intently, a slight smile appearing on his face. "You know, Aunt Claire, I admire the way you carry yourself. You look so fresh and self-assured, like life for you is an endless choice. It's impressive." I held my breath for a moment. His compliment was so casual, yet it left a strange, deep sensation inside me. I smiled, trying to hide my embarrassment, and replied something like, "Well, confidence is more a result of experience, not an innate quality." But his words lingered within me, like a thin trace that didn't easily fade, the way similar phrases usually do. Our conversation continued, and I increasingly felt that we were not just relatives, but something more. We spoke like two people who understood each other, as though there was something between us that needed no explanation. His maturity, his view on life, his gaze at me, all of it began to affect me, and I felt that something unusual was slowly building between us. When I went upstairs to get ready for the day, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was changing. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a trick of my imagination, that our conversations meant nothing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. One of those warm, sunny days, Tyler suggested we drive to a neighboring town. He confidently mentioned needing to pick something up from a store, and added that it would be a great opportunity to change the scenery and escape our routine. The idea of spending a day alone with him felt a bit thrilling, and I readily agreed. We set out in the morning, when the town was just waking up and the road ahead was almost empty. I wore a light summer dress that softly outlined my silhouette, and looking at myself in the mirror, I caught myself wanting to make an impression. As we got into the car and set off, I felt from the start that the atmosphere between us was unusual, a blend of comfort and tension. We talked about various things, from music to books we'd recently read. Tyler behaved calmly and naturally, but I could still sense something slightly distant and tense in his gestures, as though he were waiting for something. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but his actions soon made me realize that it wasn't just my imagination. On the road, I noticed that Tyler would sometimes, seemingly by accident, touch my leg when he shifted gears or gestured with his hand. His fingers lightly brushed the fabric of my dress, and each time the touch felt like a fleeting spark, making me hold my breath. His hand sometimes lingered a bit longer than could be written off as an accident, but he kept a casual expression, as if nothing special was happening. This subtle contact and his gaze, which occasionally slid over my legs, enveloped me in a mixture of excitement and embarrassment. I felt both thrilled and unusually attractive, as though I were seeing a new, unexpected side of myself. Finally, we reached the town, and along the way, we decided to stop at a small cafe. Inside, it was cool and cozy, and we chose a table by the window, overlooking the bustling street. As we settled in, I noticed that Tyler sat closer than necessary. The moment we got comfortable, his knee brushed against mine under the table, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I didn't pull away, and he seemed not to notice that our legs were touching. Or at least he pretended it was a coincidence. We talked about his plans, his life, about what inspired him, and with each passing moment, I felt that his attention to me was becoming increasingly significant. It was more than just a conversation with my husband's nephew. There was something more between us that couldn't be expressed in words. After we returned home, the evening descended into the usual quiet. John went to bed early, exhausted after a long day at work, and the house seemed to settle around us in a feeling of solitude. Not wanting to part ways for the night, Tyler and I headed to the backyard to enjoy the starry sky. The air was cool, and I relished the light breeze on my face after a busy day. We sat side by side in garden chairs, gazing up at the night sky. There was something calming in this silent moment, and it seemed like each of us found something personal in it. Tyler, deep in thought, looked contemplative, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. He began sharing things with me that I realized had been troubling him for some time. He talked about his doubts, about how difficult it was to find his own way when it seemed everything was already decided. He spoke of his fear of disappointing his loved ones, about how hard it is to accept oneself when people always expect more from you. Tyler's words were unexpectedly sincere, and in his voice I heard something deep, as though he was revealing hidden facets of his inner world. I listened to him, and in that moment, he stopped being just my husband's nephew. There was something in his revelations that touched me to the core. We exchanged brief glances, and I felt something strange, as though our bond had reached a new level, becoming more personal and genuine. Suddenly, he fell silent, and in the heavy quiet that followed, his hand accidentally brushed against mine. The moment was so quiet and tense that I felt my heart stop for a second. I didn't pull away, though perhaps I should have. Instead, I felt his touch leave a deep mark on me, a trace I couldn't ignore. We continued to sit in silence, and I realized that something irreversible had happened between us. I was on the verge of acknowledging that our relationship had crossed a boundary beyond which there were no familiar explanations. But despite that, I wasn't yet ready to admit to myself what this moment truly meant. John, inspired by the calm summer evening, decided to host a small party for close friends and family. The house gradually filled with people, the sounds of laughter and the gentle hum of conversations. I chose an outfit for the evening that highlighted my figure, a light dress that hugged my body, as if made to catch people's attention. I felt more attractive in this dress than usual, and that subtle thrill only intensified. As the guests gathered, I spotted Tyler across the room. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt a strange, warm sensation spread through my body. His gaze seemed to pierce me, and in it, I sensed something more than just attention. Tyler looked at me as if I were the only person in the room, and each time our eyes crossed paths, I found it hard to breathe. The evening smoothly transitioned to dancing, and as the rhythmic music began, I suddenly found myself beside Tyler. He suggested we dance, and I, unable to refuse, agreed. Our movements were synchronized, as though we both felt the same spark, the tension filling the air around us. We danced closer and closer together, and at one point I felt his breath close to me. There was just the slightest distance between us, and with each look from him, my inner tension grew. I saw how he kept his gaze fixed on mine, creating an almost unbearable sense of attraction. We were so close to each other that it seemed as if there was no one else around. It was an inexplicable aching feeling, pushing me toward the edge of my composure. The desire to be closer, even closer, was so intense that I could barely control it. I felt an overwhelming urge to spend more time with him, to feel him near, not just physically but on a deeper, almost forbidden level. But sensing that I was on the verge, I abruptly pulled away, ending the dance. The feeling overwhelmed me, and I realized I needed to be alone to catch my breath, calm down, and regain control. Saying that I needed to check on something upstairs, I went to my room, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I paused by the door, leaning against it, understanding that I could no longer ignore my feelings. I fled to my room, feeling that I couldn't stay at the party a moment longer. My heart was racing, as though my body was trying to tell me something I was afraid to admit. Closing the door, I tried to calm my thoughts, but the excitement was too strong, overwhelming me, making it impossible to think clearly. Suddenly, there was a quiet knock on the door. I had barely begun to think before the door opened slightly and I saw Tyler. He looked concerned, the same tension in his eyes that I had felt from the beginning of the evening. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, entering the room and closing the door behind him. "You disappeared suddenly. I thought something had happened." I tried to find calm words to explain my departure, but everything inside me was in turmoil. Our eyes met, and the tension between us was almost unbearable. My words stuck in my throat, and I could barely contain myself from showing how deeply these feelings affected me. Tyler stepped closer, and in his eyes, I saw the desire I had noticed before, but now it seemed raw and unguarded. He licked his lips, and that fleeting gesture only heightened the feeling building within me. For a moment, I thought I could still step back, but my body seemed no longer under my control. He reached out and gently touched my face, his fingers gliding over my cheek, and I realized that I could no longer resist. We both knew that this step crossed every boundary, but the tension that had built between us finally found an outlet. Tyler leaned in, and before I could stop him or myself, our lips met. That first kiss was gentle, but it held the power of everything we had been holding back. I felt my hands slide over his shoulders, and giving in to the moment, I allowed everything to happen without looking back. Tyler responded with the same passion. His touches grew more insistent, and we both lost control, stepping beyond the limits of what was acceptable. Thoughts of morality and rightness vanished, leaving only desire, pushing us forward. We were so immersed in this moment that we didn't notice we were being watched. Suddenly, the door swung open, and I heard a sound that froze my blood. John stood in the doorway. His face was contorted with shock, his eyes filled with disbelief and pain. In that moment, I understood that our secret was out and that the consequences were unavoidable. After John saw Tyler and me together, everything around seemed to freeze, and the room filled with a heavy, unbearable silence. But that silence lasted only a moment. Before I realized what was happening, John had already stepped toward me, his gaze full of anger and pain. "How could you?" His voice was sharp like a blow. "With him, in our house?" Tyler, standing a little farther away, was frozen, but then he stepped forward trying to say something. "Uncle John, it's my fault. It's not her fault." His voice trembled, but he tried to protect me, taking all the blame onto himself. But that only added fuel to the fire. John turned sharply to Tyler, his fists clenched. I could see his eyes darken, and in his look was the urge to take out his anger on the one who had betrayed him so deeply. "You," he growled, taking a step forward. "You didn't just betray me. You destroyed everything I trusted you with. You come into my house, take advantage of my trust, and then—" He took another step toward Tyler, ready to lash out at him, and I jumped between them, not knowing how to stop this confrontation. "John, please don't," I tried, desperately trying to bring him back to calmness. "This was a mistake. We both—" But he wasn't listening to me. His face was twisted in rage, and he was ready to lash out at Tyler. At that moment, the noise attracted the attention of the guests, who rushed in, drawn by the sounds of raised voices and the tension in the room. Several people held John back, preventing the inevitable clash. "Calm down, John, don't do this," his friends pleaded, trying to keep him from losing control. He struggled, but they didn't let him go. After a few minutes of struggling, John finally seemed to realize that everyone was watching. He froze, breathing heavily, his eyes full of hatred and pain, the disappointment impossible to hide. Later, when the guests left and the house once again fell into silence, John remained cold and silent. Tyler tried to approach him and explain something, but John wouldn't even look at him, shutting himself off from both of us. I could see how hard it was for Tyler, but I knew words wouldn't change anything now. That night, without a word, John made his decision. He told me he needed time and space to understand what had happened. I could see that his decision to leave was not spontaneous. It was the final step to preserve some pride and dignity. "I need to go, to figure out what happened to us," he said, looking away, unable to meet my eyes. "You two can stay here if that's what you want. I can't bear to see you together." These words sounded like a sentence, leaving Tyler and me alone with our feelings and the awareness of the irreversible. When John left, the house sank into silence, but this time it was filled with something much heavier than mere quiet. Left alone with Tyler, I was tormented by guilt that didn't let go for a single second. We both knew we stood on the edge, that every next step only made our connection more unjustifiable and painful. But despite everything, I couldn't overcome my desire to be near him. Every time we crossed paths in the house, every look we tried to hide only fueled the feelings I had. Now, without John nearby, all the emotions I had been holding back began to overwhelm me with new intensity. Inside, there was a constant conflict between guilt and an attraction that seemed uncontrollable. Tyler felt this struggle too. He avoided talking about what had happened, but every time we were alone, our eyes spoke more than any words. We began to spend more time together, at first cautiously, with short meetings in secluded parts of the house. These moments were filled with tension and contradiction, but each time I tried to pull away, something held me back. It was as if all my principles and restraint dissolved in his presence. One of those evenings, we were sitting in the kitchen, engrossed in a conversation about trivial things, but between us hovered something more than words. His hand unintentionally touched mine, and I felt the same spark I'd felt the first time. I should have pulled my hand away, stopped it, but instead, I allowed myself to remain in that moment. The seconds stretched endlessly, and as I looked at him, I realized that the attachment I felt for him had already grown into something far more significant than just a fleeting desire. Each of our meetings became more meaningful, more painful, and sweet at the same time. I understood that there would be no going back. My marriage to John now felt like a distant life, and I knew that whatever my future held, it would never be the same. When John returned home, I felt all the weight of guilt and fear I had been hiding rise to the surface. He entered the house quietly, but from his expression, I knew that the silence wouldn't last. We were alone in the living room, and the tension hung heavily in the air. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold and firm, and I knew there was no avoiding this moment. I nodded, but inside everything tightened. I understood what was about to follow, and the fear of having to face the truth overwhelmed me. John looked at me, his eyes full of pain and disappointment. "Why? How could you?" he asked, and those words pierced me. His voice was quiet, but each word seemed to echo in my mind. I couldn't look away, though everything inside me resisted. Shame, grief, and regret filled me, but I knew there was no use in lying or hiding anymore. "John, I'm so sorry," I said, feeling as though every cell in my body resisted those words. What happened? It wasn't just a fleeting temptation. My feelings for Tyler, they're real. I can't deny that. These words were difficult, but I understood that there was no point in pretending anymore. I looked at my husband with regret, realizing that I had destroyed everything we had built over the years. The words I had just spoken hung in the air, exposing a truth we both had tried to avoid. John froze, as if trying to grasp what I had said. His face showed everything: pain, disappointment, anger. He remained silent for a few seconds, then, through clenched teeth, he forced out, "I never thought you were capable of this, Claire. Never." His words struck me like a blow, and I knew that these wounds would stay with him for a long time. My regret was sincere, but I knew it would change nothing, wouldn't undo the damage I'd caused. John stood up, looking at me with icy determination, and quietly but firmly said, "I can't endure this anymore. I think it's best if we separate." Those words sounded like a verdict, echoing in my heart. I knew this moment was inevitable, that after everything that had happened, he couldn't stay with me. But despite that, the pain of his words pierced me deeply. I understood that the choice I had been running from had finally caught up with me. When John left, the house plunged into an oppressive silence. Left alone, I felt an emptiness far more suffocating than I had anticipated. Without John, without the familiar morning conversations and his quiet presence in the evenings, it seemed as though the foundation of my life had crumbled. I wandered through the empty rooms, as if searching for something to hold on to, something to remind me of what it felt like to feel whole. But the silence offered no support. I felt a helplessness overcome me, draining my strength and pulling me into a depth that seemed inescapable. Without John and without Tyler, my life felt like a shadow of what it had once been. The two people who had filled my thoughts and emotions had left me, and I realized I had nothing to strive for, nothing to cling to. I began reflecting on myself, on the motives and desires that had led me to this moment. I had always thought of myself as independent, strong, confident. But suddenly I realized how deeply I had relied on the approval of others. Looking back, I understood that perhaps everything I had done, every choice, in life, in marriage, even in my relationship with Tyler, was less about my own decisions and more about a desire to feel needed, significant, desired. In that moment, when I allowed myself to be swept away by Tyler, I thought I was discovering something new within myself, that perhaps I could find the passion and freshness I had thought lost. But instead, I had destroyed everything that was dear to me. My search for new experiences, for something more than I was used to, had proven to be just an illusion that had cost me dearly. Now I realized that my hunger for novelty and risk had destroyed not only my marriage but also my self-image. One quiet evening, Tyler told me he had decided to leave. His face showed resignation and weariness. His eyes held an understanding that things couldn't continue as they had. We both recognized that the tenuous thread binding us had snapped, leaving only emptiness and memories. "I need to go, Claire," he said. And in those words, there was more of a farewell than in any long conversation. "I think we both need to move on." We stood silently as the shadows deepened around us. Tyler slowly extended his hand and touched mine, but there was no passion in the gesture. It was simple and honest, like a final full stop. He looked at me with sadness, and in his eyes was all the pain and weight of this goodbye. I understood that our past would stay with us, change us forever, but we could no longer return to what had been. When Tyler left, I was alone. The house was empty, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. All the emotions, pain, disappointment, guilt, merged into one, an understanding that I could no longer live by looking back, lost in regret. From that day, I decided I had to start anew. Every corner of this house was filled with memories, but as days passed, I realized I needed not to run from the past, but to accept it. The mistakes, the broken relationships, my search for something more, all of it was part of me. I knew I couldn't return to who I once was, but perhaps that was the beginning of my true journey. Over time, I found joy in simple things. Life, although it felt empty, gradually filled with new meaning. I didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt an inner peace. The past couldn't be undone, and these mistakes had become my lessons. Taking my first step in a new direction, I realized that I had a chance at a future I could build on my own, accepting myself with all my flaws and past mistakes.